Hi there, and good morning, everyone. My name is Miles. I am the landlord liaison for the Hamilton Regional Indian Center, and I wanted to thank you for tuning into my presentation. So, I'm here to talk today to hold a little presentation on landlords and tenants, rights, responsibilities, and relationships for both. My new role here at the center, I will be working on resolving some conflicts that arise between landlords and tenants, and also on a regular basis looking for um, new housing and new landlords to work with for community members. So the first thing I wanted to address is a rental application. There seems to be a little bit of disjoint in terms of understanding what a landlord or what an application can actually request on it. So if you look at the current slide that I have up on a rental application, specifically, what can a landlord ask me? Well, your landlord, or a potential landlord, I should say, is certainly entitled to ask you for your full name, first and last name, and any middle names. They can ask you for your phone number, cell phone, or home number, your email address if you have one. They can ask you for your date of birth, and the reason for that is to conduct a credit check. There are two ways to do a credit check. They require a permanent address, a full name, and they require one of two, either a date of birth, month, date, and year, or your social insurance number. Both are not required. You could do a credit check with one or the other. So that is the date of birth portion. And of course, if you do decide to give your date of birth, that also then lets the landlord know your age. Your landlord is allowed to view a piece of photo ID that is not a health card to verify that you are who you say you are, so that no one else is renting from you or renting from the unit. They should not be photocopying it. They should not be recording any numbers off a driver's license or anything like that. And of course, anyone who is going to be living in the unit that is above 18 years of age, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, brother, sister, etc., and any children who are over 18, the landlord can ask for all the same information for them as well. All right, continuing on, the landlord also can ask for some more information on your general application. They can ask about your rental history, and that means specifically where you're living at the moment. When did you move there? Who is the landlord of that current unit? The landlord's contact information, their phone number, email, etc. And of course, they can ask for the previous landlord as well. If you only lived somewhere for, let's say, 6 months, your new landlord would, to consider your application, can ask for the landlord in contact information for where you lived prior to that. Normally, as a rule of thumb, landlords, like banks, will ask for a 2-year living history, where you've lived over the last 2 years, so they have a good idea and they can follow up and in contact where you've lived. Okay, continuing along. A rental application and a landlord can also ask you about your employment history. Specifically, where do you currently work? How long have you worked there? The name of your supervisor. What do you do? Clearly the name of the company and what your income is. Again, if you're at a relatively new job, meaning in the last year or so, they can also usually ask about your previous employer as well. And that all comes from trying to help them determine if it is reasonable that they can expect a regular um, monthly rental check to come on time from you. So that sort of goes off in that direction. They For the amount of previous employers, they can go back as far as, again, 2 years seems to be a reasonable expectation, unless you have a very choppy work history, meaning 1 month here, 2 months here, 6 months there, 3 months here. 2 years should be more than enough in total going forward. So you're looking at your last kind of 2, 3 jobs, possibly one job, depending on how stable your work history has been. So continuing with income questions and employment, um, the landlord has the right to ask where the bulk of your income is coming from. So if it's not employment history, is it from ODSP? Is it Ontario Works? Is it a grant? Is it family giving you money? Whatever. Is it employment insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That is not an unreasonable question. They can also ask the amount of income. So how much are you getting a month from Ontario Works? How much are you getting per month on ODSP, etc. They can ask for, and it is a good idea also to report the income of other family members. Clearly, the more income you have, the more favorable it looks for your application. So, but I would caution you to limit that to family members who are over 18, meaning family members that can contribute. And of course, any additional income, that area gets a little spotty, and because what that qualifies for is on a case by case basis. Some people will want to know how much you get from a GST check because it can help you. Some landlords will want to know what you get from child tax benefit. Banks, for example, when you try to qualify for a mortgage, they don't care about your GST income or your child tax credit. So that's on a hit and miss basis. But I do encourage you that if you are filling out an application on your own, and you do have additional income such as child tax benefit or GST or something like that, include it on the application because it only makes for a stronger application. It won't hurt you. Covering off most of the issues, most of the points that a landlord can ask, of course, there is a side of things that the landlord cannot or should not ask for. And I've created a couple of those examples for you as well here. So we're going to start with a credit card number. While this may be obvious, some people that are tight for ID, for example, will try to use a credit card to prove their identity, and in some circumstances it can be used. Clearly, if you have an ID of some kind that doesn't have a photo on it, but or can't be used like a health card, but you have a credit card that matches that name, there is some wiggle room there. But they can't ask to take down the copy of the number for obvious reasons. Having the credit card, the name, and the 3-digit code on the back, plus the expiry date, makes it very easy to go shopping on someone else's credit card. They can't ask for a photocopy of your ID. And again, for the same reason, it's very easy with photocopies of ID and ID numbers to commit fraud. They also shouldn't write down an ID number, such as a driver's license number. A landlord cannot ask you if you have a criminal background or for you to provide a criminal background check. Those kind of questions are completely human rights violations, and they cannot ask you that. Social insurance number. So this is, if you remember, back in one of the first few slides, we talked briefly about getting a credit check done, and there's one of two ways to do it. All credit checks require your full name and your most recent or your current address where you're living. The next step is either one of two things, either a social insurance number or your date of birth. You don't have to give up both. You can do one or the other. They shouldn't be asking for your social insurance number if you've given a date of birth. But if you don't want to give up your date of birth, then you have to give them your social insurance number. You have to do one or the other, okay? But they shouldn't be asking for both. And finally, not finally, but in addition to all of that, they shouldn't be asking you as an applicant for anything they wouldn't ask of any typical applicant. For example, if they say we want, if you're 17, 18 years old, we want a guarantor on the application for you because you're 17. Now, if they ask that piece of information for every 17-year-old, then it's fine. If they ask it just because of you, then it's a concern. All right, they should not be doing that. Continuing on, a landlord should not be asking you for copies of your bank statements. They should not be asking you for banking information. They should not be asking you about your ancestry. Obviously, where do you come from? Are you, for example, are you native? That question really shouldn't be taking place. Just as much as it shouldn't be asking, are you Pakistani? Are you Muslim? They shouldn't be asking about your religion. They should not be asking your age. They should not be saying, I will only rent to people who are 25 and older. It doesn't work like that. However, be aware that if you do give out your date of birth, they know your age. So one way to hedge against that would be to give up your social insurance number instead of your date of birth. But that's up to you. They should not be asking your sex or your sexual orientation, marital status, none of this personal information, because none of that should be relative or important to making a decision should the landlord rent to you or not. Um, Political beliefs. If you happen to be a conservative, or you happen to be a liberal, or an NDP supporter, or you are in love with Donald Trump, or you hate Donald Trump, none of those questions should be asked. They have nothing to do with your ability to be a good tenant. Um, in addition, they shouldn't be asking about physical or mental disability or any social disadvantages. Again, none of that is really relevant to your ability to determine your ability to pay rent, and if you are a desirable tenant for their unit. Okay. So, covering all the do's and don'ts that landlords should be asking about on an application, the natural decision or question pop into your mind is, why does a landlord need all this information? Well, the landlord has an agenda in all of this. A landlord, in a perfect world, just wants to collect rent checks on time with no headaches. That's it. They want a tenant that will treat their building or house or room responsibly as if it was their own property. Landlords do not want to be called for plugged drains, toilets, pest infestations, bed bugs, things like that. They're not interested in those type of phone calls. Uh, and they really want to leave you alone. They don't want to be visiting you every 5 minutes to see what's going on and if you're okay. They're not into all that. So because this is what a landlord wants, they gather as much of this information as they can so they can weed out tenants who may be an issue for them. They don't want a tenant who will be late on the rent all the time. They don't want a tenant who is going to damage the property. They don't want a tenant who is going to cause damage in the property, or someone who's going to result in them having to come out all hours of the day to fix something. That's the bottom line. So, what happens if a landlord asks for something they shouldn't? Well, those of you that have applied for units in the past and have seen your share of applications, you will know that landlords often ask for stuff they shouldn't be asking. They will ask for copies of your bank statements to prove your income is coming in. Um, you know, it's an issue. It is definitely a concern. So the truth is, it's not right, but it happens. And if it does happen, you need to ask yourself a couple things. First of all, do you really want to live there? And if you really want to live there, give them what they want. Yes, they shouldn't be asking, but they are. Um, if there's something on the application that you're not comfortable with asking, you don't have to apply, and you can look for a different place to live. The truth is also, you can file a human rights violation complaint, and there's a chance you'll win. That being said, the reality is, um, if you are looking for a place to live and you are trying to get off the street or you're trying to get out of a bad situation, I'm fairly certain the last thing on your mind is filing a human rights complaint to try to win some money when you need a roof over your head. That's going to take months, sometimes years, to happen. So um, I don't know how feasible it is. Again, it's wrong, but it is the nature of the beast at the moment. So why are landlords like this? Why are landlords asking for stuff on applications that they know that they're not allowed to ask? Well, the truth is, there's a lot more people looking for rental units right now than rental units are available, particularly here in the Hamilton area. It's a problem. The city's aware of it. We're aware of it. Other social services in the Hamilton area are aware of it, and landlords are aware of it. This is what allows landlords to pick and choose to rent to whoever they want to. So I'm fairly certain that a lot of people are very um, aware of various problems you can have with a landlord, and One of the biggest problems that develop obviously is non-payment of rent or late rent. So this is the number one concern for a landlord, for obvious reasons. And I realize that there are disputes with landlords all the time over not dealing with pest problems, not fixing units, responding to complaints in a timely manner, things like that. And then tenants feel that they can um, withhold or slow down rent payments in order to motivate the landlord to fix something. And while I understand the logic behind this, it really is not an effective way to resolve an issue. Um, and I'll explain why, because I think everyone in the community is fairly aware of their rights and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking a little more on the landlord's perspective on things. So, um, if you think of a large unit or a house that has, a couple of rooms rented out, whatever, that landlord more than likely is using that rent to pay the mortgage on the property. When the rent payments are late or they don't show up, the landlord has to come up with money out of his or her pocket to make up that difference, to make sure that there's not a problem with the mortgage. If the landlord is constantly late with mortgage payments, what that means is that the bank, when it comes time for the term of the mortgage to renew, will more than likely not renew with that client. They're going to say, you know what, thank you, Mr. Landlord. You've had a really bad payment history with us. Your mortgage payment is always late, so we're not going to renew your mortgage. You have to look for somebody else. So if that happens, the landlord now has to go to a different type of mortgage provider, something called a trust company or a credit union or a private lender to keep the property. Those types of lenders charge higher interest rates. They charge a bunch of different fees to give the landlord or to give the person their mortgage. If that happens, your rent is going to go up. The landlord is not going to make up the difference for you to live there. So on the next slide, I'm going to go over some numbers with you to try to illustrate how this all works. So with properties being expensive and properties moving up in price over the last little while, I chose to do a $500,000 property. So we're going to assume that the mortgage on the property is $500,000. We're going to assume that the interest rate that the bank has given this individual or this organization is 2.49%, and that the mortgage is amortized over 25 years. And there's no point in me going into the details of what an amortization is. It's irrelevant for this conversation. That monthly mortgage payment works out to $2,237 a month. Right? Very simple, straightforward. Now, let's say the landlord is late on their mortgages a couple times, and the bank says, no, we don't want to talk to you anymore. You're going to go find a mortgage somewhere else. And they go to a trust company or a credit union. The credit union says, sure, Mr. Landlord, we're going to give you your $500,000 mortgage, but your interest rate is going to be 2% higher than what you've been paying. So that's going to be 4.5%. Again, amortized over 25 years. That works out to a monthly mortgage payment of $2,767 a month. You'll notice if you look at when the interest rate was 2.49%, the mortgage payment was $2,237. That's a $500 difference per month. Now, in addition to that, in order for that trust company to give the mortgage, they're going to charge what's called a lender fee. And it varies from bank to bank, from institution to institution. Some might be 1%, 1.5%, 2%, 2.5%. I went with 1.5%, which works out to 1.5% of $500,000. That's $750. Most property owners will need to use a broker to find alternative mortgage deals for them, and that broker charges a fee for their work to find the mortgage. An average rate would be 2.5% of the total amount borrowed, so 2.5% of $500,000, which works out to $1,250. In this type of scenario, a lawyer is required to do the mortgage work. The lawyer charges an average of $1,500 to do the work plus tax, but we're just going to keep it to $1,500. And typically, the bank or the trust company will request an appraisal to be done. And those appraisals will cost typically around $400 taxes in. When you add up all that stuff plus the actual mortgage payment, that works out to a difference of $855 a month with all those fees added on, whereas before the mortgage was $2,237 a month. So now we're well over with another $855. So now that particular house or property is no longer an affordable housing scenario. That property now has been eliminated from folks that have very tight income to provide housing. That's how those properties disappear. In addition, there's other problems that are irrelevant to making late mortgage payments, but they all contribute to cheap housing disappearing. So I realize that there may be a stigma out there with landlords are out driving Lamborghinis and they're making money hand over fist. The truth is, it's not the landlords typically that are driving Lamborghinis and going on vacation every 5 months. The bank managers and CEOs of the banks and trust companies definitely, but not the landlords. Okay, so that would be an example or an illustration of the impact of possible consequences with late fees, or sorry, with late mortgage payments. So rent payments clearly one major issue for landlords. So let's move on to something else now. On the next slide, next couple slides, I have illustrated some common issues that pop up with the landlord, and I just wanted to highlight a little bit of the consequences of such. So something I've come across so far here at the short time I've been at the center is, and actually from a couple of friends who are landlords, one is garbage accumulation. That sometimes tenants become very complacent in taking out their trash on a regular basis. And that's, it happens, particularly if you're working late, or you're exhausted on the night before garbage day and you forget to take it out. It happens. It happens to all of us. It happens to me, and by the time you realize when you lay down in bed that tomorrow's garbage day and it's midnight and you got an early day tomorrow, or you're behind on something and you just forget to take it out. So it happens. And I guess 1 week, is not going to be the end of days. Clearly consequences. It's unhygienic. It's stinky. It can attract a lot of pests, both to your unit and other neighboring units. And of course, if it's an ongoing issue, it can result in eviction. Illegal activity. It goes without saying, but it is worth mentioning. Drugs, fights, stealing, etc. It clearly leads to a criminal background, which is going to be very, very difficult for income, because a lot of places for employment now will do a criminal background check for income, and it also results in possible evictions due to criminal activity. And I should also point out that even though at the moment, because of the pandemic, the landlord-tenant board is closed, they are hearing eviction requests and filings remotely over video conferencing for evictions due to criminal activity. So those are still going ahead, and something you should all be aware of. We should all be aware of that. Things like plugging up the toilet. It happens. Especially if you have small kids in the house, right? The kids don't know, and there goes the little Hot Wheels car down the toilet, and it happens. Sometimes food is left in the fridge, a stew or something, and it's gotten a bit thick. You pour that down the toilet to try to get rid of it, and if you do it enough times, obviously it'll be jammed, and the toilets will plug. It'll certainly happen, especially in older units where maybe the toilet pipes are not as wide as in a newer property. And of course, this will be fixed every so often when it does happen. But don't forget, if a landlord has to call a plumber to snake the toilet and pull stuff out, they're going to see why the toilet was plugged. And if the toilet's plugged for obvious reasons, like what it's being used for, such as, I guess a really bad evening at McDonald's, or Taco Bell for that matter, That's perfectly fine. But if there are, if there are constantly toys being flushed, if there are constantly, for example, feminine hygiene products being flushed, wet wipes being flushed, things like that, causing the plug up, eventually the landlord is going to say, like this has to stop or you're going to be evicted, because they can't afford to keep coming out, calling in all hours of the night an emergency plumber to come out and open up plugged up toilets. So again, it's important to be mindful and respectful of what the toilet can handle. Just like garbage accumulation, it can all lead to a nasty environment. So with that out of the way, I thought I'd do a little bit of a comparison in terms of, what does a landlord want and what does a tenant want, or my understanding of what a landlord and tenant would want. So a landlord wants their rent on time, and we talked about the consequences of the mortgaging and stuff like that, and what impact that can have. A landlord wants little or no maintenance issues. If they put in a new stove, they expect that stove to work for the next 15, 20 years. Not because, the stove has been damaged or got water damage and now it's fried and has to be replaced. Landlords don't like complaints. The landlords definitely do not like police, and landlords don't want damage. All these are expenses that has to come out of pocket to be repaired or dealt with, and it takes away from the ability to for the landlord to pay down the mortgage. And my understanding for tenants, what tenants want and again, these are all perfect world scenarios because things are always going to change. So a tenant wants privacy. They don't want a landlord sneaking up on them. They don't want them banging on their door at all hours of the night. They want a safe and functional working apartment or unit or house. Windows aren't leaking, bathtubs aren't leaking, etc. They don't want to be visited or hassled by the landlord. If something does need to be repaired, a tenant, I'm assuming, would like that to happen relatively quickly, depending on the severity of it. Um, if the building is in bad shape, which happens, uh, I am assuming a tenant would like to see ongoing repairs. The stairs are being fixed, the balcony is being fixed, the shingles are being replaced, et cetera, et cetera. If a tenant has a complaint, for example, that another tenant is making noise, the tenant would expect the landlord to respond relatively quickly to that. Furthermore, if there are pests, for example, bed bugs or mice or something like that, the tenant would expect that the landlord would respond quickly to problems like that by having a fumigation company show up, and set traps and do what's required. So everyone has an agenda. In the perfect world, there is a magic area in between landlord wants and tenant wants that gets everyone to work together. And that's what we're going to try to focus on. So I want to focus a little bit on where everyone can get along. So for a landlord, evictions are a hassle. They're expensive, they're time consuming, and they're basically a money loser. For a tenant, looking for a new apartment now is becoming more and more difficult. So it's in everyone's best interest that the landlord and tenant get along because that leads to minimized evictions and less, and the tenant doesn't have to go look for a place. Evictions are expensive, and they're expensive for a couple of reasons. I've pointed here, think of mortgage costs and lawyer fees. So while an eviction is going place, I'm assuming the tenant is not going to be making rental payments or slow down the rental payments. Of course, now the landlord has to make up those mortgage payments on his or her own to keep the bank happy. The landlord has to hire a lawyer or a paralegal, which is an expense to work on removing the tenant. The landlord now, if assuming the landlord wins at the landlord-tenant board, and the eviction will go ahead, and he or she gets a judgment, for example, for any rent arrears, that landlord is going to put that on your credit report and going to pursue you. That will show up. That obviously is going to be an issue. The consequences, obviously, to you, the tenant, in that scenario, is that while you can be difficult with your landlord on eviction and stopping rent payments, etc., You're going to lose out on the opportunity to get a good reference. You'll lose out on your rent deposits, obviously. Um, there's a chance you're going to get a reputation as a bad tenant. And Hamilton is a very small community. It's not a huge city like Toronto, but it's a very small community, and reputations can run abound. Um, this Going through these procedures is in no one's interest, and the name of the game is to try to avoid this as much as possible. Also, the landlord looking for a new tenant is time consuming, and in the meantime, while the unit is empty or being repaired or what have you, the landlord is making those mortgage payments on his or her own out of pocket until the unit is filled again. So the point of illustrating this is it really is in the best interest of a landlord and tenant to work together. You don't have to be looking for a new place. You don't have to be looking over your shoulder. You don't have to worry about getting a bad credit report. You're comfortable with your landlord, etc., etc. The landlord has his rent payment coming in on time. He doesn't have to bother going through landlord-tenant board hearings. He doesn't have to hire a lawyer or a paralegal. None of these expenses creep up, and everyone gets along. And I know, again, this is a perfect scenario in a perfect world, but my job here is to try to illustrate what both sides need and want. Okay, so that's my position on that. So how do we get what we want? We've identified now that landlords and tenants kind of need each other for various reasons. Um, and how do we get to all these points? So the first one, the bottom line is it's communication. All right, and that is so true in pretty much everything in life. You need to communicate, and I know that when life happens, um, you lose a job, you break up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, money all of a sudden dries up, somebody gets sick. There's a lot of things that can happen, and all of a sudden you feel like you can't pay your rent or pay your utility bill, for example. And stuff happens, and everyone understands that because everyone is going through stuff. The pandemic is a perfect example. Um, your initial reaction is to hide, right? That's what you want to do, right? Remember back when you were a kid in school and you got in trouble, you pulled Susie's hair, and you're like, oh man, as soon as the teacher finds out, I'm going to go to the principal's office, or whatever, and you want to hide. You want to hide. You don't want to talk to anyone. So I'm here to tell you that it is important to keep the lines of communications open in all circumstances. Do not hide. Keep in touch with your landlord. When you see him or her or the property manager, say hello, good morning, good evening, etc. Be pleasant. If you have a complaint, try to be polite. Don't bark at them. Ask for advice or help on an issue if something isn't going well. If you have a problem with a neighbor, don't be barking at the landlord because you're angry. It's not the landlord that's causing the problem. It's that horrible tenant beside you that is just very, very noisy. And ask for help. All right. If you're handy and something needs to be repaired in your unit, let's say, I don't know, the tap in the sink in the bathroom is leaking hot water. Ask the landlord if they can buy the piece, the parts required, and you can fix it on their behalf if you're handy. It's not something you have to do, but it's a show of good faith that you're ready to help if you can. If you're going to be late on a rent payment for whatever reason, call your landlord and tell them as early as you can. Ask if you can maybe make a partial payment. So if your rent is $500, $800, and all you can do is $400 on the rent date, see if you can make the $400 payment on that date and have a plan on when you're going to make the other $400 up for the landlord. And have a plan before you call. Or, and a plan is I can only come up with $400 right now, but in a week I'll be able to come up with the other $400, and explain the situation. And I'm short this month because my dog got really sick and ate a chocolate. I had to take him to the emergency vet clinic at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it cost me $500. And that's where the money went. I got a pay coming in shortly, and I'll be able to make up for it. And most landlords will be understanding, particularly if it's not an ongoing, reoccurring issue with you. If it's once in a blue moon, they understand that life happens. Remember, they have to make mortgage payments, and sometimes life happens and they can't make that mortgage payment on time. It's no different for you and your rent. So they have an understanding of what you're going through. Um, have a good reason why you're going to be late. Like I said, someone in my family got sick. I got laid off because of the pandemic. And what is your plan now? Well, I applied for EI and I got all my documents together, and I should be starting to get my EI within a week. My company transferred me somewhere else to a different job site, and there's an interruption in my pay. So when I do this, it's gonna, as soon as that comes through, I'll be able to make up for it. I was laid off temporarily because of the pandemic, etc., etc. If you communicate with your landlord and you are honest, if you try to make your best effort, put your best foot forward, the landlord would likely respond even more positively to other things that creep up, like a plugged toilet, a leak, a bad window, etc. Because they know that you're trying, that you're working hard. They know that you are a responsible tenant. So I think it's important to realize that while tenants and landlords have different needs and wants, both of them actually need each other. A landlord without tenants is not a landlord. It's an individual who is making large mortgage payments on more than one property out of pocket. And a tenant without a landlord is at risk of being homeless, clearly. So one doesn't work well without the other. So it's important to realize that the nature of the relationship between landlord and tenant is a partnership. There's no one person that's in charge, although I know sometimes it can feel like whatever the landlord says goes, and that's not the case. What you're looking at now on this slide is some points from a landlord that she put this up on a website, and it's at the bottom there, OntarioLandlords.org, and this is her goals to a tenant. So her goal is, please take care of our property. I know it's your home, but it's my house. If I know that you will keep your home in decent condition, I'll be much more motivated to ask you to help me pick a color next time I paint the walls or replace the carpet. So again, and all she's illustrating there is when it's time to do some maintenance, and if you're the long-term tenant there, you'll be asked, is there a particular color you'd like me to paint? Because if I have to do the work anyway, I personally don't care if the wall is hot pink or cement gray. Well, okay, maybe I would, but you know what I mean. She promises to respect you and your personal rights. I will give you all the notice I can before I have to enter your apartment. After all, it's your home, but it's my house. If I need to replace a toilet or fix something, I will give you an advance notice. I hope that respect will be mutual. After all, it's the little things that count. If we can all get along, we can both enjoy working with each other. I am not here to mess with your life. As I mentioned, landlords are not interested in being a difficult person in your life. They're interested in collecting rent checks and living rent-free or stress-free. Something to keep in mind is some landlords were once like you. They were renters. So her third point is, I was you once, perhaps you will be me one day. I know what it's like to rent. I know what it's like to be a tenant. It's actually a decent way to live. I never worried about the roof, the plumbing, needing a new stove or fridge, or even if the carpet was getting worn down and needed replacing. I never worried if the city increased utilities or taxes. I paid a flat rent, which could only increase by a very small amount each year. I let my landlord worry and take care of all of that. You need me and I need you. If neither one of us are jerks, this will work out just fine. And I couldn't have said it any better myself, which is why I literally cut and paste this into the presentation, giving credit to OntarioLandlords.org. I think that really sums it up nicely in terms of landlords and tenants both need each other. So negatives into positives and steps you can take. So again, there are some stigmas out there with renting. Sources of income are one. Income from ODSP at Ontario Works typically is seen as it can be seen as a negative. And it takes quite the skill and gift to turn something that's really negative into positive. But I'm just using this as one example. Clearly, there are many different examples that we can go over, but I'm just going to focus on one or two. So sources of income, ODSP and Ontario Works These sources can often be viewed as a negative. However, what many landlords may not know is that you as the tenant can arrange for money from your ODSP or Ontario Works account to be sent directly via direct deposit to the landlord's account, reducing or eliminating the risk of late rent payments. Remember, landlords want to collect rent checks regularly and on time. So that is definitely an advantage to landlords. You can't do it from a paycheck. You can't have your paycheck go directly to your landlord via direct deposit. It has to go to your bank account first, and then you can forward it. But Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Program, they can forward the money directly to the landlord, and that should provide some comfort to the landlord. Weird accounting. Sometimes, especially in larger commercial buildings, like that have like 20 floors, 30 floors, accounting can fall behind. Rent increases, penalties can often take a few months to catch up on paperwork. That being said, it doesn't mean that because they forgot to do it, that it's been waived or forgotten. You are entitled to ask for a detailed accounting of any fees, penalties, and interest before you pay them. Remember, interest and penalties can keep adding up, even once a bill is issued, and if it's not paid, they can continue on. Your landlord should be forthcoming and willing to provide a paper trail for all accounting, including rent payment receipts. So what I mean by that is, if your rent is $850 a month and all of a sudden your landlord sends you a bill and says you owe me another $100 for the following month, they have to provide evidence of why that is. Was it because you were late? Was it because some damage was done? Is this part of a rent increase? And they have to provide validation for that. In addition to that, every time you do make a rent payment, you are entitled for a payment receipt for proof of that. Now, I'm not an accountant, but my understanding is that the expense of rent can be included on a tax return to help offset some income. So that's something that's a possibility as well, and that's very useful. But remember, any weird accounting that pops up, you have a right to ask, where is this additional money coming from? What are the interest charges? What are the penalties for? How much are the penalties? And don't forget, all this should be in your lease agreement. Okay? So continuing on with negatives into positives, a major issue, again, is problems with other tenants. Those of you that have rented and rent on a regular basis, you know that sometimes somebody moves in who is just a problem. And for whatever reason, whether they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, whether there's fights breaking out, there's a lot of screaming and yelling, whether there's alcohol abuse, drug abuse, etc., try to help your landlord. So your landlord has to deal with complaints, noisy neighbors, pets, pet noises, etc. Try to help your landlord by recording as much information you can about the complaint that you have. What time was it? What exactly did you hear? Where do you think it came from, and why do you think it came from that unit or that room? How long did it last? Has it happened before, and when? Can you record it on your cell phone? This will help the landlord try to resolve the complaint and provide the landlord with proof and evidence in order to move forward on your complaint. Remember, sometimes the tenant making the noise may not even be aware that they're making too much noise, and all it's going to take is a gentle reminder by the landlord saying, we've got some complaints that you were watching Star Trek a little too loud, and can you just, after 11, can you keep down the TV a little bit? Can the landlord evict a tenant over making too much noise? Well, the first place to look at is your lease agreement, and I'm fairly certain it'll say you can. And if it's something that's a chronic problem with mistakes and complaints all the time, then the answer is likely yes. You are not respecting other people's right to privacy, right to enjoyment, and therefore the landlord can ask you to vacate the unit as well, which puts us back into the scenario where landlords and tenants do need each other, and it's important to work together. Okay, and with that wraps up this morning's presentation. I hope I answered some questions and gave you some things to contemplate and think about. I know and I realize that this was a lot of information. Some of it was very technical with the numbers and things. But remember, the point is to illustrate. And of course, if there is something that you're not sure about, if you weren't perfectly clear. My email is there in front of you, landlord liaison at Hamilton Regional Indian Center, hric.ca. My cell number, 905-516-0963. And of course, when the center reopens, when we're kind of through this pandemic stuff, I'm if I'm not in the center, I'm out chasing landlords, and if I'm not chasing landlords, I'm in the center. So feel free to drop by and say hello. Uh, I would also welcome your feedback. This is being posted to Facebook, and feel free to shoot some questions. I'd like to do a follow-up later this afternoon where I could answer some of the questions that this presentation has brought up, or if there's something that you feel I missed or you'd like to ask, I'd be very happy to address it. Just make sure your questions are generic in nature, something that isn't specific to only you, but something that is a typical or general landlord and tenant issue. I plan on doing some more of these presentations, so if there's something you would like to see and covered in more detail as we move forward, again, please feel free to reach out either to your caseworker or directly to me, and I'll be happy to work on a little bit of a program to make things, to address some more issues and concerns that you feel are useful, that will give you the tools and give you the confidence to deal with any sort of landlord-tenant issues as they may arise. And of course, if you do find yourself into a conflict with a landlord of any kind that you can't resolve, that's what I'm here for. Feel free to reach out to the center through a caseworker or directly to me, and I'll be happy to take a look at your situation and see how we can resolve it to everyone's best interest. So once again, it's Miles, new landlord liaison at Hamilton Regional Indian Center, and I look forward to working with all of you and getting to know you all and resolving some of your issues. Thank you, and I hope you have a fantastic afternoon. Bye-bye.